good for everyone. Greetings and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainability from around the world and across Africa. I'm George Mutalemwa in Mwanza, Tanzania, and I'll be moderating this session on behalf of Solidarity for Peace and Development, MAMA. Our theme today is retelling the African stories, the colonial imperative. The speaker is Divine Fu, who is Associate Professor of Social Anthropology and Director of the Institute for Humanities in Africa, HUMA, at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Thank you, Divine, for accepting our invitation to talk to us again. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, please join me in welcoming Divine Fu.
Great. Thank you very much, George, for the introduction and also for the invitation. And also many thanks to the colleagues who are here. And it is always an honor and a privilege to have to speak with you and to have a conversation, with you. When George asked, I think it was the beginning of the year, that they should come back and have a conversation, because I think it was here last year to have this another discussion. I first hesitated, but at the same time, when you have an important project, I think it's always important to support and also to join. And I asked George what George wanted me to talk about, and just said the theme this year was about telling African stories. And I had no choice but to have to align to the theme, which George had asked me to speak to. So it's very interesting, George, that the title itself seemed to have been mangled, because and which is very telling, because the title, if I could just let me see if it's possible to share a bit, but the title is retelling African stories. That's actually what it should be, retelling African stories, and the decolonial imperative. But it's very interesting what happened. And I think I may know or may suspect what happened, that AI was at work, and you couldn't do anything about it. But that's the theme itself, retelling African stories. But it's interesting, the AI cut it to retelling the African story. And it also imposed itself as the colonial imperative, which is very interesting, because AI, which in a way plugs into so many databases, and as some of us have argued, that it is near impossible to build or to regulate or to make what already exists ethical, because of the colonial library, which Mudimbe has so well articulated, which is the sum total of all what really pre-exists about us, and really are constructed through epistemologies that are very problematic. So even when you try to adjust it, it's like writing my name. Every time people write my name, the computer translates it to Divine Fur, instead of Divine Fu. Quite often already what exists and in the library is problematic. That it doesn't matter how much you tend to shift it, it pushes you to something. So I'm not surprised that the AI could not recognize decoloniality. It could only frame it as colonial. Yeah, So Um, so it is retelling African stories, the decolonial imperative. The decolonial imperative in the sense that it is an inescapable project. It is a must, and also that it is something that is absolutely necessary that we cannot avoid, and we'll speak to that a little bit in a moment. So I want to start with this story, which I posted some time back, and that I'm also writing about. I come from Bafut in the Cameroon grass fields, a place which many years back has gone through so many colonial masters and mistresses, and quite often today, I was just speaking to somebody this morning who was asking me if I came from Anglophone or Francophone Cameroon, and I was telling her how interesting that there's a country of so many peoples, over 300 peoples, over 400 peoples, but somehow the way in which one defines themselves is through one's colonial experience, and that even when people seek liberation in that context, they have no other tools but to define themselves either as Francophone or Anglophone. So, but Zingraph, you can approach Zingraph in two ways. If you search Zingraph now, Zingraph is going to come up as somebody who is a famous explorer and who was sent, through by the Germans, to go and explore Cameroon. So when people in that part of the region tell their story, they tell the story of the history in that place through this man. When he first came to contact, he explored, he opened up routes, he discovered new spaces, so he is an important figure who, as some people would argue, brought civilization, to that particular place, because he arrived through the Congo, discovered the routes, explored them, and came right down to the Cameroon grassfield and brought troops which entered the hinterland. And after entering through the hinterland, began to build both plantations and towns and cities in order to bring development to the other place. But if you read this guy differently, this is a bandit, this is an armed robber, there's a pirate, he's an ethnic cleanser, he's a misogynistic character, he's a murderer, a scammer, and somebody who was trafficking in human heads, So depending on how you approach it. So if you reread it, because while this guy was exploring these routes, he was somebody who was obsessed with gathering skulls, somebody who explored the hinterlands by pillaging, lots of artwork and resources that are now housed in museums, particularly in Germany and other parts of the world. It was somebody who was so brutal that his exploration was through murdering people, across the space. So depending on how you tell the story, he's either a hero or he's either a bandit, And when I talk about retelling African stories, it's the imperative of lots of Africans today who have to either tell the story of conquest or tell the story to the response or the reaction to conquest, or tell the story of also how their own people experience both the colonial project and the implications of that. So that's just the thesis, that to tell the story means that we need to re-engage with it. It's not necessarily having to replace it, but to reread it with another lens, with another tool, with another epistemological, framework. But I built my framework today from the Africa Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations, which is a project that we've been doing for over the past 5 to 6 years. We began the idea sometime back in 2020, launched the project, the charter in Namibia in July 2023. And since then, we've been trying to promote this. It's been adopted by over 150 different signatories. And the main project is really how we rebalance the scientific research field to write Africa into that particular space, how we rebalance the science ecosystem. But it is brought together by many of Africa's top research organizations, but facilitated by the Perivoli Africa Research Center, the Chief Albert Lutuli Research Center at UNISA, and also the Institute for Humanities here at HUMA, which I head. But why is this very important? It's important particularly for this framework, which I'm using today, which is what we have called the concentric circle. And the concentric circle, which really digs into the power hierarchies or kind of the power forces which deepens the imbalance is in the global research sphere. And I think that this concentric circle is important not just for understanding the imbalances within the research sphere, but also for responding to the question what we do with decoloniality or what happens after decolonization, which is the biggest challenge today. That when what happens after critique, when you critique this imbalance, when you critique this epistemic injustice, when we've critiqued these injustices in the knowledge sphere, how then do we move? Because the critique of the decolonial project is that it's a lot of words without practice. It's a lot of work also without tools. So why we offer this a framework is like a tool to have to partly respond to that dilemma or to respond to that question. And the tool raises a number of issues here. What we've done is to present 6 principles which help us to understand power imbalances or injustices within the research sphere or within the knowledge production context, which if addressed then leads us to a place that is more fair, to a place that is more recognizable, to a place that I think is more dignified and also more respectable. And I would say to a place where we have a voice and where we are able to tell the story better and where we become even more visible. So if you see in most projects, what happens is that we address 3 main areas. The one is that when people talk about imbalances, we talk about concrete arrangements in the knowledge sphere, and particularly where some argue the radical knowledge sphere is just that we replace one form with the other, or we just add and stir. So we don't have, if we say knowledge production is Eurocentric, so what we say is just that we replace it with what we call African knowledges, and we see that over the past years. So where we have curricula that is dominated by many European readings, we say let's just replace this and have lots of African authors and African writers. So this is just like a basic, but we're arguing that this goes beyond. We have to address. You can replace with the, African names and African writers, but you still have the epistemological issues that the epistemologists themselves come from particular places, and the epistemologists themselves center particular modes of production, particular modes of knowing, and particular ways of having to interrogate, ask questions, and also gather knowledge, particular modes of inquiry, So you could still just put African authors and African names, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have attended to the epistemological question. And then we have the question of language. And we've seen that with Ngugi wa Thiong'o and many others, that language is very central and language is very critical in our life, in our way, in our being itself, in our being, in our thinking, in our ways of imagination, and particularly in our epistemological projects, that language is very, very central and very, very critical. You see the other, which is at the level of theories and concepts, which is what we have seen with Poleno Tonji and his concept of extraversion, that our entire scientific production and knowledge production, and in fact, we can argue that our entire being is extraverted. So our response quite often to coloniality is to even get extroverted, that we are finding conceptual tools or finding theoretical tools, not necessarily because we want to speak to our own realities, but precisely because we want to respond to European or what we call Eurocentric reality. So at the end of the day, what we do is that almost our entire existence then becomes a response, like Toni Morrison says about racism, that it's so bad that it's always a response, that you spend your time. She says it's a distraction. You spend your time having to explain yourself over and over and over. They say you don't have a language. You say, I have a language. And you spend so much time proving that you have a language. They say you don't have tools. You say, no, I have a tool. You spend time proving that you have tools. So quite often our response to coloniality is distraction itself, that we spend so much time, being extroverted because our entire life is extroverted. The response itself becomes extroverted. So theories, concepts, and other stuff. The other is that even when we seek to respond to coloniality, we are still trapped within the development gaze. And the development gaze, which means that there is a certain hierarchy of being, and that quite often we are trying our best to try to measure up to or to align to what is considered as the standard. So our standard is always trying to be European or in a particular way. We are all orienting towards winning the Nobel Prize. So we want to win the Nobel Prize. So if you want to win the Nobel Prize for this, so our work is to make sure that we put that standard, and we are always orienting towards that standard. So even when we say we want to tell stories, quite often we are orienting them to that particular standard. The conceptual, the epistemological is still extroverted because we are orienting to that particular standard. And then, of course, you have the other thing about resourcing, precisely because doing all of this work requires particular resources. So we then argue that if you need to bring concrete change or want to bring a change into the system, you need it at both individual and systemic level, but particularly at the level of consciousness and capabilities, at the level of practices and norms, at the level of resources, at the level of policies, regulations, practices, and guidelines. But what is important in this framework is that to bring change, it requires us to change them both in a systemic manner and also individually. I know this sounds like a lot of gibberish, but it makes sense when we now orient that, to African storytelling, and that we have to begin to rethink at many different levels, that to tell African stories is not necessarily to replace one with the other, but we need to do work at level of consciousness, at the individual level, at the systemic level, at the informal level, at the formal level, in order to get to what we call African stories. So if you take us back to where we started in having to tell the story of Zingraf, it means that I need to go back to all of those different tools. Is Zingraf an explorer, or is Zingraf a bandit? Is Zingraf a famous explorer, or is Zingraf a murderer? And how does that change or shift then the story or the narrative of the particular place that we are telling? If I told the story of Zingraf as a bandit, how does that shift the narrative of what it is to talk about Cameroon and its history? If I told the story of Zingraf as an explorer, how does that define the story of Cameroon as a place? So really thinking deeper than just having to replace the story, thinking deeper about the epistemology, thinking deeper about the concept, thinking deeper about the theory, thinking deeper about some of the underlying things that do not seem apparent when we tell that story is really critical. So when we are telling the story, we are not telling the story oriented towards a particular standard that we are seeking to orient ourselves towards. So Uh, I wanted to start there just to provide that framework so we understand at least the context from which I am speaking. That when I talk about retelling means rewriting. Retelling means providing another account, an additional account, because the decolonial project is not necessarily about having to replace, it's having to enrich. How do we enrich the current narratives that exist? So it is not having to create amnesia, because what we see as a Eurocentric project or as a European project is a project that some of us argue, or as many have argued, creates amnesia in the sense that when it occupies you, it doesn't give space for any other thing. It doesn't allow for something else. So when you look at the responses of how we should deal with the colonial project, with coloniality, and particularly coloniality in terms of its epistemic violence and its epistemic injustice, many scholars have pushed that it is about expansion. So, how do we expand? How do we expand knowledge? How do we expand our conceptual vocabularies? How do we expand our conceptual tools? How do we expand our epistemological tools? How do we expand our various modes of inquiry? And that's, for me, that's really important. That decolonization for me is really about finding new modes of inquiry. It's about expanding those modes of inquiry. It's not necessarily having to destroy the current one, but enriching knowledge by having to expand other modes of inquiry, because those modes of inquiry do not only enrich the places that have been colonized, but also retells the story for the entire global community and also for everyone, So really, I have over the past years here at HUMA tried from time to time to do these experiments. We have this workshop called epistemic disobedience workshops, which is really building on the concept of epistemic disobedience, which is coming from Quijano and also from Mignolo, Maldonado, and also the Latin or South American scholars, which some would argue is really a 0 point, moving to a 0 point epistemology, which really does not. I mean, it's not what some of us are pushing for, that there's no such thing like a 0 point epistemology, but that a 0 point epistemology is, for me, finding other modes of inquiry and introducing other modes of inquiry, which, as Samir Amin has also argued, that there is just no way, you cannot really get to that 0 point, epistemology. And I've tried over the past years when we meet for these disobedience workshops, asking people to tell stories, and to tell the story that a big push in the decolonial project or the resuscitation of the decolonization project was about saying, we have to tell African stories, and there it's really asking two things: what is African and how you take African seriously, and the other is really to tell what you call a story, and I want to really emphasize here when I talk about telling African stories, which is a particular framework, stories not just as accounts, but it's also about accounts that are in a way Africa-centered, whatever that means, which is something that we also have to deepen what we mean by Africa-centered, because it's also a term that we throw everywhere. What it means to be African, how do we identify something as African, and how do we identify something as Africa-centered, and how do we consider it as stories? But I want to lock stories as epistemologies. I want to lock stories as concepts. I want to lock stories as theories. So when we talk about telling African stories, is how we inhabit the world through modes of being and through modes of thinking, modes of inquiry that come from that experience that is Africa. And Africa, which is different kinds of experiences, experience that is encounters with different parts of the world. There is encounters with the Arab world. There is encounters, with Africa itself. There is encounters with Europe. There's encounters with Asia. There is encounters, with the Americas, whether you're looking at the North or you're looking at the South. But at the core of this is really telling stories, is how we articulate modes of inquiry, modes of understanding the world, modes of explaining the world, modes of interrogating the world, modes of experiencing the world that comes from this particular place and its relationship with what it sees the world. And that relationship is very diverse. At the moment, what the Coloniality Project mainly does is center the European relationship, the relationship with Europe, which is a Eurocentric, which they call a Eurocentric a relationship, that it is trying to undo that relation. But there are many relationships that we have to think about, that when we talk about telling African stories, it is really having to introduce those modes of understanding, modes of explaining, modes of researching, modes of analyzing the world, modes of experiencing the world, modes of inhabiting the world that come from this experience, from this place that is informed and enriched by its relationship with the diversity of the world, and not necessarily just Europe. And like I said, when I ask many of those who come to the disobedience workshops to tell stories in the evenings, usually, because many of us grew up having to listen to and tell stories in the evenings with our uncles, our brothers, our grandmas, and lots of other people in the fireplace, in the kitchen. What we call today the kitchen, because that time it was a hut. You just moved into, it was either mama's house or papa's house or grandma's house or someone else's house. The concept of kitchen is something that has evolved, that has come today as part of our encounters with the world, that there's a separate place where you go just to cook, and there's a separate place where you go to sleep. You shouldn't remember, many of us grew up where it was just one place. It was a place to cook, to welcome people, to sleep, and to do so many other things. But when I ask many of my colleagues to tell these stories, it's always interesting. And the first experience, more than half of the group could not tell stories. Many people immediately went to the internet to search, and to find stories on the internet to articulate, But it was very interesting. I started telling the story of Kirikou. Many people would have come across the story of Kirikou et la sorcière, Kirikou and the sorcerer. And I started telling the story from a particular place, that there was this village and this, a woman and a man or couple who were having difficulties, then having children, and and they came into contact with this spiritual figure, with whom they made a pact. And as I got there, everybody stopped me, and they said, no, that's not the story of Kirikou, that the story of Kirikou starts with Kirikou coming out of the mother's womb and then cutting his umbilical cord and moving. That the story you're telling is not the story of Kirikou, So we spent this time having to talk, because they were right. It was not the story of Kirikou, but it was not the particular story of Kirikou, because the story of Kirikou had become frozen and told through a particular form and framework, which, as Chimamanda Adichie says, that the dangers of a single story is not just that it's a single story. It's just that when it is told over and over, it becomes the main and only story. And it is told over and over. It becomes believable. It becomes acceptable. and that there's no other story apart from this other story. Because even if there are multiple other stories, because the story has been told so many times and been put in a particular form, it becomes the only story. So they were right that it was not the story of Kirikou, because it was the only way they had come to see, understand, experience, and tell the story of Kirikou, which, if you watch, Kirikou comes, is born, he comes out, crawls out of his mother's womb, and then cuts his umbilical cord, and then starts running and getting into the world. So every other thing I was telling did not make sense, to them. And that's the challenge of what we call today the African story. That the African story itself, or what we retell today as the African story, is trapped within that frozen framework. That when you take from a place where knowledge and experience of the world is something that is plural and something that is always evolving, because every time somebody tells that story, they tell it differently. Because every time somebody tells that story changes because it's being told by someone else. So the story may have the same frame, but it's always shifting. But it is recognizable and accepted because it is a story understood, but all because knowledge itself is always evolving. So when we tell the African story, we have to take it out of that epistemological framework, that epistemological violence, which freezes it as something that has been written and that pre-exists within the colonial library. So the Kirikou story that my colleagues were referring to was a story that was frozen in the colonial library. And when you freeze the story in the colonial library, it is frozen epistemologically, it is frozen theoretically, conceptually, it is frozen in terms of the language, it is frozen in terms of the many things that I said. It is caught in the development gaze, it is caught in so many different other things. So if we want to tell the African story, which is the entrapments that me and my colleagues found themselves, we have to take it out of that colonial library. What happens when a language that existed just mainly as a language that was articulated or existed verbally, is a language that now gets a written form? What happens to the possibilities of its own creativity? What happens to the possibility of its own evolution? Like this investment that we have now in having to save languages, that we need to freeze them because they need to be frozen, because then we deny them the possibility of that evolution. So if we are going to move into a decolonial project, for me, modes of inquiry that allows us to not necessarily freeze, but to allow for the possibility of that evolution, or the possibility of that flexibility, are very, very important. So with my colleagues on that day, the story of Kirikou ended. So I couldn't tell it further because we spent so much time trying to argue about the little details about what was the true Kirikou story. The Eurocentric project, as we articulated, as we understand it, is a project that freezes. It's a project that is caught and entrapped within the Cartesian logic. And the fact that it is so whole, it is so continuous, it is so predictable that there is no other way for us to do it. So if we want to tell the African story, we need to take it outside of that Cartesian logic. Not that that logic is not important or that that logic is not useful, but that in order for us to expand, we need to enrich it with other logics, that logic can still exist by freezing it, but allowing other modes of articulation, other modes of organization, and also other modes of inquiry. Had my colleagues allowed me to tell the story of Kirikou, we would have learned another way in which the story of Kirikou helps us to explain, the world, or explain, how, how we not just inhabit, but also how we, tell that story of young people trying to change or or reimagine, the world. So I started off with Zingraph, moved up to provide the framework, which entraps us that for us to understand and retell the story of Zingraph, it is important to understand that even when we pick up tools for decolonization, quite often it is an imitation and orientation towards we deepen the violence by reproducing, recreating, and that the fact that we are saying it's an African story or that it's being told by an African or being told by somebody who wants to tell it as an African doesn't necessarily mean that it is not recreating and deepening the same violence, precisely because we have not unpacked those layers of power that continue to deepen it within the colonial library, to use Mudimbe. As Mudimbe says, the colonial library is so tough that it is near almost impossible for us to escape it, because every time we work with it, we try to change it, we're trying to deepen it. So it's in the archive. So it means we're reading the archive differently. It means having a response to knowledge. We learn with science that science is generative and that science leads to new science, and that it is the burden of this generation, or is the burden of knowledge producers today, not to just abandon as some people push. We are not pushing for an abandon. In fact, all knowledge is important because, we are nerds of knowledge production and nerds of science. All knowledge is important. But what we need to do is to allow for space for breathing. We need to allow for space for these new other modes of inquiry to help us reread what already exists, but also to invest in expanding, in finding other ways of having to understand the world. And I think that the burden to us now, the burden for this this generation, the burden for those who want to connect to the decolonial project. Otherwise, like I said, George, when I started off, the AI refused to accept decoloniality. It was just insisting to trap me into the colonial library. And like I tell my colleagues all the time, every time the AI changes my name from food to fur, you must make sure you force the AI to keep teaching the AI that it can understand another having to inhabit, the world. Yeah, I think that's the contribution I thought I should bring to you today, that decoloniality and decolonization we can move from critique to praxis, which is really having to find different conceptual vocabulary, different tools of inquiry. And that one of those is having to tell stories, and that telling stories doesn't necessarily mean just having to give account and entertainment, but that it actually refers to methodology. It refers to modes of inquiry, modes of understanding, modes of explaining, but also the tools of understanding and the tools of explaining, which are contained in that thing called African stories. And that when we pick those stories, we have to then ask ourselves, what kind of stories are we picking and what kinds of stories are we telling? Are we just having to freeze them in the same colonial library that we have found them in, like those who say we just have to move to our languages? My language was written by missionaries, and it was written in a form to explain my words to those missionaries. It's very useful that that language was written. It's very interesting today when I pick it up, what am I picking up? When I used to use Bafut today and say Bafut is written, Bafut is written in a way that is meant to explain that language into a European attempt to pronounce it, and etc., etc. So when I pick it up today, what does it mean for a Bafut person to now take that same tool and impose it upon their own language? So I'm asking for really deeper work. Decolonization requires us to do more work. It requires us to do more work not just for us to liberate people, but to enrich the world. And it's not just important for the people who have been colonized and for whom amnesia has imposed a reference that is extroverted and frozen, but it actually enriches the entire global community because it offers us new tools to understand our own predicament in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in many other places. It's not just for us, it's for many other people. So this project of having to tell these stories is not just a project for people in Africa, it's a project for people in the global community. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Divine Fu, for the excellent presentation. And thank you also for correcting AI. Now we have a clearer title, retelling the African stories, the decolonial imperative. And you've shared with us quite a good number of useful tools, concepts, ideas about, the epistemologies, I think from, well, all over the world, but particularly from Africa, where we are talking about telling the African story, but just like also telling, and say, Asian story or European story, etc. But also you've talked about languages or language, theories, concepts, and this question of extraversion and the development frame and gaze, the institutional resourcing, the capabilities, the concrete collaboration arrangements. And I wanted to find out actually about this framework, the Africa Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations. You said you started it a few years ago, and maybe you'd like to share with us who are the participants, and whether it's open for everybody to take part in that, because that could be useful. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
And of course, then I will. Yes.
Sorry. No, I was saying I've just put the link on the chat. I'll put links on the chat. Anybody can sign up to it. It's a charter that is meant to deal with the imbalance of the global science ecosystem, which actually places certain parts of the world and certain countries, both on the African continent and it's interesting, particularly in Europe, in the peripheries, of knowledge production. So the charter really seeks to rebalance by really trying to explain why this has happened, explain also why this is important, and then to outline a set of 10 principles, which if we do follow, will lead to this a balance, or we deal with this imbalance. And it's really a critique. You hear a lot about equitable partnerships today, so we're arguing that we need to move to something which we call transformative collaborations, research collaborations. So the underlying word is transformative, which is really having to collaborate with the intention of having to undo the injustices, which is collaborating with the intention having to orient yourself towards a more respectable world. So a use in decolonization, which is also a political project, because we shouldn't forget that the intention is having to move to a particular place. So my approach to decolonization is transformative, that when one engages, one is engaging with an intention of having to move us to a better place. And that better place for me is is a place where knowledge is enriched rather than having to reproduce the same system. So if we are going to replace what we call Eurocentric stories or European stories with African stories, then the logic remains the same. Because the critique of colonization or coloniality is that it acts through amnesia. So you cannot move to that place by having to replace it. And that's what I mean by when we are doing African stories, they're just coming in to enrich the world. It's not necessarily to have to replace one with the other. Yeah. But I'll put the link.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Thank you so much. And Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. I did not want to go first, but I must testify. This is one of the most brilliant presentations we have had, in my opinion. Thank you for the brilliant analysis of AI's fatal limitations. I'm hoping it is not going to end us by just sealing us into that, what was it you called it? The library. The library of hell. This comes from, I spent my 17th year in Nigeria, straight out of 1963 America, where the most that I knew when I landed was from Tarzan movies. And the night we arrived, there was a plague of blister beetles. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to be in this country where the bugs land on you and make your skin erupt. Of course, we never saw them again. But I had the great adventure of attending a Tarzan movie in an African cinema in Nigeria in 1963. Half of it was outdoors. And the whole experience of being there, like being on another planet, completely changed the course of my life, completely shaped me. My heart was broken, and it was broken and broken and broken. And finally I had to realize that it was breaking open. And I want to thank you profoundly for this marvelous work that you're doing, and the genius that you're bringing to it, and your incredible skill with telling this complicated story. I will shut up now and go and weep.
Thank you so much, Peter. And maybe Divan would like to respond, but I think it was not a question. But anyone is welcome to ask or make a comment. Now the floor is open. We can share our own stories. Richard, you're welcome. And then Dr. Laid.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to you all. I'm so glad to have been a part this year. Telling a story, what I see is everyone would want to hear someone tells a story. For example, when I would want Dr. Mute Lemwa to tell me more stories about himself or Tanzania. You see, I see it to be automatic. When I don't know how to put myself in this, but I've noticed that there is a story that one has to tell about himself or herself, or where he or she comes from. You see, at times I get friends from outside, and immediately I see them. I want them to tell me a story from their place. You see, they also want me to tell them a story from my place. So I want to know what particular story do Africans have that we need to tell. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. Let's take some more questions. We'll take from Laid and Eliseo. Laid, please.
Good afternoon to you, George, to all the panel, and of course to the speaker. Well, from my own view as an Algerian, and Algeria, which went through 132 years of colonization, I found this, I would say, this presentation quite controversial. When we speak about the colonial imperative, what do you mean? Do you assume that we should be recolonization, or what we should do? I mean, and it's a compulsory that we should have to go through the colonial perception and the colonial understanding and the colonial reception. I think this is it reminds me one of this funny word concept, colonizability. It means some people in some countries are keen and inclined to accept colonization. And what do you think? And I'm talking to the speaker, of course. What do you think about the decision of the African Union during the last summit, the 39 summit in Addis Ababa 2 weeks ago, about, of course, many countries, including Algeria, asking for reparation and for repentance and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Laid. And then Eliseu. Welcome.
Dr. George, thank you very much for this work, for the word.
Thank you.
And I would also like to thank the presenter for this wonderful presentation. And let me also thank all the participants of this webinar, which is just great. From the last week's presentation to this week, I see that in 2026 we are very high. I would like to thank Dr. What is his name? Did I check here?
Divine Fu.
Yes, Dr. Fu, for this wonderful presentation. But as I was listening to the arguments, it raised some questions similar to those which Professor Laid is raising. As I was accompanying the presentation, I seem to understand from it a paradox of African stories and colonial imperative as two opposite images. The African story standing for Black identity, which is historically, let's say, associated with has been associated with racial inferiority and all survival. And on the other, it talks of the colonial imperative, which we can also associate with the Western modernity, a symbol of rational superiority. And it's what I was thinking as it presents. What does African stories stand for, and what does the colonial imperative stand for? Let me ask this. Does the presenter seek to resolve this tension between African stories or Black identity by placing hope in young Black people who live within the Western modernity, think and question with its logic without ceasing to be Black? Is that what the presenter is trying to resolve? Or otherwise, should we understand that Black identity is lived between memory and survival, whereby we learn foreign languages, we value external references as youth, and sometimes we adapt modern standards, but risking our own languages, our own story, our own identity. And I would like to understand well from his explanation, what is he suggesting that the new identity should be? What should African values be right now? A mixture, I don't know, it's quite difficult question, but I don't know if Dr. George, you understood what I want to say.
Thank you so much, Eliseo. I think I did understand. And I would like now to ask Divine if you could please respond to the three questions from the participants, Richard, Laid, and Eliseo.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And to thank the friends and colleagues and, brothers for their contribution. It's not always that you have people who listen to anything you say and also to take it seriously. So every time somebody does it, you have to be very grateful, So thank you very much. And these are very important. I'm going to start with Peter. Peter made a comment about AI. And it's a serious comment. One of the big projects that we do here is around AI. And the simple question is, how do we think AI through Africa, whether we can Africanize AI? Is that possible? It's a simple question, and also whether AI can be ethical. And what I've done in the past year is to give a simple response. It is possible, but at the current moment, almost impossible. And at the second, I've said it is that we cannot really make it ethical. And the reason I say is because of the original sin. And the original sin, for those of us who grew up also, where I grew up, you wake up in the morning, you go and see the seer to tell you your future. After that, you go to church to pray, and then you come back, and then you go to the government to work, go to school, and then you come back and you go to the bar, drink, and then come back home. So it's a multiplicity. But the original sin we were taught is the sin of creation. And the original sin means that once you've been created, you are a problem. Therefore, you have to spend your entire life seeking to address that problem. And the problem of AI is the problem of creation. And that it comes from a dark place. It comes from a place where people have to build technology without rules, because that allows them to build rules, the freedom to be able to do it. And then after they've done a lot of that stuff, now we say, no, we need to put in rules. So the sin of creation is critical. And also that it depends on data, and data that already exists. Data for me, even though it's current, it's the past tense, even if you collected it just yesterday. So of course there's current data that's been created, but quite often the databases are things that have already happened. And Valentin Mudimbe's concept about the colonial library is precisely about that it's not just the knowledge, but the epistemology that has been deployed to create that knowledge, the concepts and the theories that have been deployed to create that knowledge. So it doesn't just suffice you to tell an African story. The very fact that you're calling it a story is already problematic, because that concept of a story, if you were to take it originally, does not exist in that context. Because in that context, the idea that there is an account that is structured, that is systematic. I mean, you need to just search and see what the definition of a story is. It will tell you that it's a narrative that is structured and has A, B, C, D, etc., etc. So, and that's where part of what I started was to trouble that how do you tell the story of Zingraft, if you want to tell one frozen story through which many of our countries' histories have been written, you say, you know, we got civilization when Zingraf came and contacted us, you know. So now, if you're going to build a new technology that is founded on having to plug on to that, you're going to find a lot which is, but going back to that particular place. So AI may seem very small here, but to tell our story means that we need to take AI seriously, and we need to take the frame. That's also why the concentric circle I present, that there is more layers beyond what we see. So it's not just enough to say, oh, now the AI is dominated by English. We need now to change it to Bafut as we sing, or to change it to Swahili as we're saying. Now, Bafut is struggling, like I said to you the last talk that I gave, that now Bafut is struggling now to tell you what mourning is. But what you call Bafut is what the missionaries use to explain to them how these people were speaking, not necessarily your language, you know. And in many of our languages, if you understand our context, people speak in metaphors, you know. So uh, you now start taking things literally. So there's so many layers that you have to do, but taking AI and its logic seriously, because it builds on archives, and lots of archives which Mudimbe calls the colonial library. So, and that takes me, you know, to the next question, which is from Richard. He's saying, telling us a story is automatic. What typical story do Africans have that we need to tell? I tried to define that, and that there were two things there: African and story. The first is to spend time to unpack what it is to be African. Some people they think the response to what it is to be African is to go back to the colonial library, which, as Mudimbe says, is inescapable, you know, and they then pick from it and then import. It's like what is presented as African cloth or African wear. You know, like, you know, when I go to a meeting and I wear something, and then people say, "Divine, they like you because you like to wear your traditional wear." Oh, fascinating. You know, who said wearing a suit is not a traditional wear? You know, why is having to wear my shirt with those colors traditional wear, not wearing a suit as a traditional wear? What is it that makes us think that uh, a British person, an English person, or a French person who comes with suit is not a traditional wear? You know, so, but in order to do that, it means going back to the tool, to the modes that have come to create that and made one as taken for granted. And the other thing, who says wearing this t-shirt is not a traditional wear? You know, what makes wearing this t-shirt okay as just wearing a t-shirt, and me wearing another shirt, everyone automatically says, oh, is that your traditional wear? You know, so when I talk about telling African stories, it's first unpacking that. How have we come? What is it that you're deploying that you call Africa? You know, and whether you're reading Mudimbe, whether you're reading Oyeronke wrote this beautiful text, which has constituted a core part also of her intellectual work, which is the book about the invention of women, you know. And in that book, it's not that she's saying that woman does not exist, but her key point is that in the way in which it is articulated does not exist. In the conceptual vocabulary that you're using, in the tools that you're using, in the epistemological way. And then she spends a lot of time to explain how we have come to have this particular mode that we call woman now, you know, which is the same with a man, with states, with lots of different things. So, and what she's trying to do is that we need to interrogate, which is what I said the last time I was here with Mamadou Diawara, with Jean Bernard Ouedraogo, with Elisio Makamo, and their work really around translation. What happens when we translate, you know? And it is Hari Garuba, the late Hari Garuba here, who's spoken about the troubles with with translation and literal work that we can say that we want to say something in something African, but actually what we are doing is just reproducing and deepening the violence. We are actually creating more erasure as we are saying we are translating, because precisely like I said, the concept of story is a concept that does not exist in many spaces. You impose it, and you have to make the story. It's a story. It's a story of folklore. When you say story and you say folklore, are those the same things? When you say story and you say experience, are those the same things? What do you mean when you say story? And how is it understood in that context? So it requires us to unpack that. So when I say, what is the story? What is a typical story? What typical story do Africans have that the world needs to know? Is that Africans are not just Africans, but through Africa, we want to say that the world has other modes of inhabiting the world that we need to plug to that would enrich the world. These other modes do not only come from Africa, but also come even from the same Europe, where for a long time, a particular mode of being. Remember that the university was a particular place for a particular nobility, for a particular bourgeoisie, not for working class people. Because quite often when we talk about Europe and Eurocentrism, we seem to generalize. We forget that even in European society, there are so many people who live outside of the margins of what has come to be constituted as knowledge. English is the Queen's English. So it's not the English of the people who support working class soccer clubs, it is the Queen's English, So it is important that when Africa helps us to understand the limitations of the world, because we are centering a particular way of seeing, understanding, explaining, and experiencing the world. So that's my response to you about story, that unpacking story, unpacking African is important. Then there was Laid. I think Laid also fell into the trap of AI, because the theme, I started off by saying that actually my title and the theme that I was speaking to was retelling African stories, the decolonial imperative. AI, that's what my explanation. When George sent me the title as retelling the African story, the colonial imperative. So me and my colleagues, we spent time to debate whether we should write to George and tell George to change it or not. But I decided not to, because it precisely spoke to what I was going to speak to today, that the colonial library is so strong that even when you type it, the AI says, no, this decolonial, what is it? It doesn't exist in the dictionary. So it must be colonial. So AI changed it to colonial imperative, and that's why you are speaking to the issue that you're speaking to. So it's not really about the colonial imperative. It is the decolonial imperative. So it is about how we undo these years of coloniality, how we reckon with this coloniality, how we deal with this imposition that you've spoken about Algeria and so many other places. But the AI insisted that the title was going to be coloniality, and then the last question, which is from Eliseo, I would take the last part of it, what is he suggesting? Which I think he also fell into the same trap. I really love it, because the AI said coloniality, and that is the provocation that has come. But it's really about decoloniality. And I don't remember talking about identity, but it's important. I also don't remember talking about blackness, which is really important. But if there's anything I could speak to that, is that all of those are also ways of inhabiting the world, categories, and also identities that need to be interrogated, that we need to ask questions, we need to recount the histories. You know, I always say that I became African when I went to Europe the first time. Then I was classified as Africanish and then also alien. You know, it is the only form. Then I discovered that every time I met somebody, people would say, oh, there's an African here. And then when I moved to South Africa, I became Black. You know, it was then categorized as that other form. At every one form, we have so many identities which are very important. But what we need to then understand is the ways in which it describes our collective experience in the world, but also the ways in which the world engages with us. African is one, Black is another, but both are all interrelated, but also describe different relationships and encounters with the world and how we explain our experiences. In some places, people would also associate with the African, like African American, African Caribbean, African this, and then you also have others who say Black African, Black this, Black that. So, but they are all categories which really speak to a particular kind of subjugation, a particular kind of devaluation, which comes through years of relationship with the world, but particularly with Europe and modern Europe in the past years. And that's also from where the Decolonial project has been born. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Divine, for the excellent explanation. And some more questions, please, from the floor.
Dr. George?
Yes, please, go ahead, Eliseo.
Yes, I would like to, if you allow me to come back. I really love the explanation from Professor Divine. He's really divine. Yeah, I understand he didn't talk about Black or Black identity, but I was just trying to say it that when I saw the African stories, for me, it called my mind to the Black identity. And when I saw the colonial imperative, it is where I did not understood very well because of maybe the word colonial, which I would like to remake it and turn it into Western modernity. So it is there, first of all, where I had my problem. How to relate Black identity, which I understand as African stories, and to colonial, because I see in the word colonial something negative, and I called Western because I see in the word Western something positive, because it is an influence. But I think the explanation he has done has made me feel happy. But what I wanted to insist is, from his perspective, from Professor Divine's perspective, can we talk of African identity today? When we see the forces of globalization, how they have mixed us together, and we have changed, essentially. As he was saying that even African stories today, we tell them not in our own languages, which maybe could describe them the way we want them to be, but we learn languages, we learn English, we learn French, we learn Dutch, we learn Spanish, and we tell the stories in those languages. So are they still African stories? Are they stories about Black identity, or they are just world stories, humanity stories? So this is my question. Can we still talk of Black identity in those stories today, or they are world heritage? Because we mix in them. The story itself is coming from a context, from Africa, but the language that is describing that story is a Western. I think that one language and the story, they make themselves another culture, which is not African and which is not Western. So can we still talk of Black identity, African stories, in those stories which are told using Western languages? This is my question, essentially. Thank you.
Let's take, thank you so much, Elise. Let's take two more from Chip and Donna. Chip, would you start, please? And then
Yes.
Donna.
Thank you so much, Dr. George and Professor Devine. I did not hear the word emotion or maybe the word feeling used very much. And I heard experience used and I heard imagination, but I just was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about emotion, which seems to me so central to stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chip. Donna, please.
I want to make a comment that may be completely out of context for everybody here. It's the concept of African. I spent several years in museums in North America cataloging African textiles from the pre-independence period and some from the pre-colonial periods in various countries. And they didn't look anything like what we call African textiles now. Nowadays. And what I discovered is that there was a time when fabric prints in imitation of Indonesian Indonesian hand-printed textiles were manufactured in the Netherlands and shipped back to Indonesia via the West and East African coast. And a lot of those textiles were dropped off and they came to be associated with Africa, which they were never associated with. They were Indonesian. Am I making any sense? But what we have now in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning now of the 21st century is that certain types of, I don't want to say gaudy, let's say loud or bold is a good word for it. Bold printed multicolored fabrics are called African prints. So I may be wearing, and in fact, I have a keyhole kitenge, which is an imitation of an Ethiopian embroidered tunic that hangs in the British Museum in London. And people associate it with Africa because it was picked up in Africa. And people will say, oh, I see you're wearing an African print. No, I'm not. I'm wearing a knockoff of an Indonesian print by Dutch manufacturers in the early 1900s. So I don't know, what am I telling you? This is a historical tidbit. Okay.
Thank you so much, Donna.
Anything I've said.
Yes, I understood what you said. Donna, thank you so much. Divine, would you like to respond to Chip's and Donna's?
Yes, so there are three.
Ideas?
Starting with Donna, thank you for the historical contextualizing, and there's nothing to add to it. That's the story of what we called, African print. In fact, in some places, it's funny, you hear that it's not just African print. People will say they've bought Holland wax, so
Yeah.
it so it's still there, but it's interesting. Just a few weeks back, where there was it in Zambia where the Ghanaian president went? And there was a big outcry, about the dress that he was wearing, kind of a funny blouse and etc., which are some of the few places where you still have people doing loom, are still working with loom like they used to do in the past, and you still have some of that wear. But a lot of it now, even back when I go to Cameroon now, I grew up with what we call now traditional wear. It used to be woven and also sewn by hand with and knitted, but a lot of it now is just print, of course, in the past used to be exported, but some of it now, those patterns are now printed in the country and also outside. So that's why asking the question what Africa is really critical. I mean, to go back to Eliseo, that I started African stories, that we need to interrogate what Africa is and all of the issues he was raising, Africa in the world. A few years back, uh, I remember, I think it was President, either I think it was Sarkozy or Macron or so, France, who was in West Africa and said the need to bring and impose French back. And there was a group of scholars who came together to write an article. I think Achille Mbembe, I think Felwin Sa, I think a group of others, and said French is an African language. It was a very provocative paper, and that the more people speaking French outside of France than French people, and that a lot of the French language is actually shaped by those people, the immigrants in France, and then many people outside. It's the same thing. I think just 2 weeks back, we saw that the English vocabulary is every day being enriched by words from Pidgin, particularly from Afro-pop. I think just last 2 weeks or last month, it was Nyash, which got into the dictionary, into the vocabulary, from Afro-pop. So it is very important that we don't take for granted. And that's the whole point we're starting off with the concentric circle, Alicia, that we always have to go through different layers. Concentric circle is about seeing knowledge as a kind of an onion, and that there are different layers of having to understand it. Just as Donna is saying about the what we call African print or African textile, which is really shaped by the Netherlands relationship with Indonesia, and then exporting that to the African continent. And that has become central. The question, because it's a relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands, has Africa not written itself into the print? Of course we have, because is it just about the print or the context in which the print has been located, or the kinds of symbols and meanings that have been given to the print, and the ways in which it has come to be appropriated and owned? So can we say that English is English? I would argue that English is no longer English, and the English are just holding on to English. It is Americans that have changed English. It's the Canadians that have transformed English. The New Zealand that have transformed it. Australians have reshaped it. So there's so many outside of England or the UK who have then redefined what it is, to speak English, and that's why when I write Decolonial, the people who have constituted English in America and created these computers cannot take decolonial. They keep imposing that it is colonial, So I get your point, but things have changed. It's the same with identity, what we call identity. And we have to ask these questions. If we want to create a project, a decolonial project that enriches the world, we cannot take it for granted. We need to invest in its patience, having to understand those histories like Donna has indicated, then having to understand what we consider to be new, having to understand what we borrow from other places. We have our relationship with China, for example, we don't talk about. Every time we talk about our relationship with China, it is articulated also through another anxiety. Like Eliseo Macamo talks, for example, writes in his book about crisis, that our response, for example, to COVID-19 is taxed to Europe's response to crisis in the world. So the way we respond is exactly as how Europe responds, and it's been universalized. He writes very beautifully how during floods he goes to Mozambique to a community and he's asking them about the crisis, and they're saying, what crisis? The crisis, there's somebody's wedding they have to go to, and they don't have a dress to wear. That's a crisis, there is a funeral they need to attend there. They need to pay their respect to that. That's a crisis. So what crisis are you talking about? So all these NGOs have come to resolve a crisis, but there are other crises, So the standardization is the challenge. And, you know, the Black experience is a particular experience, and an experience that one must never forget and must continue to hold on to and also to enrich. It's unique. It is also an experience in the world that has been devalued, and that also needs to be addressed. Reparations, we should not be arguing about reparations. You have to pay. It's not an argument that you should be having. Like, Zingraf was a bandit and a thief and has looted, and it is located in museums all over Europe and particularly in Germany. They need to pay for it. That's it. It's banditry. Shouldn't be arguing about it, you know? But that doesn't mean that we cannot be asking questions about the entanglements that we've come to find ourselves in. Being Black is an entanglement. Being African is an entanglement. It's like an articulation of a category that has been imposed to you also through a violence that has also given you a particular experience through the world, but it has also become a unifying force that it has created particular identities in particular places and cultures that we cannot also throw away, you know. So these nuances are really critical. But what I'm pushing for, Eliseo, is that we have to invest in tools. We can only enrich the world by not necessarily having to freeze them in that colonial. The fact that they're in a colonial library doesn't mean that they are not important or not useful, but there are other ways of articulating them. But we need to move outside of just saying we are going to replace one with one, but understanding its histories, understanding, finding other ways of having to explain it, finding other ways of having to understand it. I think developing tools for explaining what we already know or what we don't know, or finding out what we don't know, instead of just saying, oh, this is witchcraft, you know? You know? So when somebody dies in Bayang land and the Bayang people spend time doing a kind of autopsy, opening up and finding out why did this person die, do you code it just as witchcraft? Or do you spend time trying to understand what is it that they're trying to do? Is this an autopsy or is it something else? And is it possible that you could enrich the world with that, you know? And it's that, but it needs careful work. The thing is that we are in a hurry to want to necessarily replace one thing in the other. We are not investing time to do this kind of inquiry. And that takes me to the question about emotion. Yeah, emotion is important. And it's asking, what is emotion? Emotion has become a critical part that is trapped within the Cartesian logic, that everything that is outside of it is considered emotional, that it's become some kind of an insult, especially in knowledge production. When politicians want to say that you're not thinking well, they say you're emotional, you know? And it's become a category that is used to define people who are not in the center. It used to define women, it's used to define Blacks, it's used to define people who are all outside of that particular core. But over the years, we've seen that emotion is an important sensory tool which we use to inhabit the world. And in this particular project, it's critical. We can't. That's why when we talk about other modes of inquiry, it is having to look about other sensibilities, other ways we understand, other ways we explain, other ways we translate, other ways we transmit, and definitely emotions and not just imagination is very critical.
Thank you. Thank you so much indeed, Divine. And we are slowly actually coming to the end of this webinar. Oh, Evelyn, you are welcome to say something. We still have some minutes for sure. So you're welcome to ask a question or make your comment.
I just wanted to say that my first time out of Africa at the age of 17 was to Germany, and forever in Germany I was the African. So I just wanted to mention that, yeah, I was the African, and I guess this is another topic, but emotionally, because my formative years were amongst the Wahehe of Tanzania, there's an element in me that feels totally African. By definition, I'm the daughter of colonials, and there's a sociology of third culture kids that were from one culture raised in another and then moved to a third culture. And the question of, am I African, am I not African, is a very emotional one. And so I just put that out there. I feel African, but I'm white.
Thank you very much indeed, Evelyn, for that story. And now I would like to ask Divine for a final word for us.
Okay.
But we really thank you so much indeed for your time and for being with us. Welcome again, definitely. And we need more stories and more humor. Yeah, thank you. Divine, please.
Yes, so thank you very much, and thank you very much, Evelyn. Francis Nyamjo has this book. It's entitled it's Rosmos 4. It's nibbling at resilient colonialism. And in his work is really he's making a very important point, and which is also what both Ifeoma Jame and also Oyeronke is making. There's a concept of masculinities without men, patriarchy without men, and that whiteness is not a white monopoly. So making the difference between whiteness and white is really critical. Whiteness is mostly manifested in the white body. White bodies have easy access and more access to whiteness than anyone. But whiteness is something that inhabits any containers, you know. So, and whiteness is a particular way of inhabiting the world. So when you separate those, you see that the challenge is with whiteness, not necessarily with white. But the second problem is that it is white bodies and white people who have had access to and benefit from and also articulate whiteness more than anyone else. Just same like patriarchy, you know, the same like that it is men and male bodies, and particularly, you know, heterosexual male bodies that have had access more and manifest patriarchy more than anyone else. But patriarchy is something which others can also play out. So the decolonial project and the shift is with whiteness, and we can change whiteness, you know, because white people do not necessarily have to play whiteness, you know. But black people also have access to and articulate and play whiteness, you know, and you see it in so many different ways when you interact. What kind of privileges people have, what kinds of ways they articulate, what kinds of ways they indicate the world, they engage the world, what kinds of erasures they create, what kinds of, you know, hierarchy. So once we said that, we know we are moving to a place that's more respectful, you know, where we don't just take the container and have to mistake it for the content. See? Yeah, and that's what I would say, George, that's the whole push, but it requires careful work. We are so impatient because we want the answers now and immediate. And every emancipatory project that seeks to distenter the world, we always give it the burden to provide us with immediate answers. So when women say it is an equal world, we say, no, you must give us the solutions now. You know, the time, the patience to try to understand through a gendered lens, to analyze the world through a gendered lens, to seek to fix it through a gendered lens, it takes time. It doesn't mean you have to do it immediately. It's a whole ECOS is a project that is whole. It's the same thing with the decolonial projects. If we don't give it the time and to seek to address it in the words, in what we eat, in what we think, in how we create what we think, in the standards that we create, in the infrastructures we live in the homes, all the things we've taken for granted, we will continue to create the same toxic world that has led us to the cul-de-sac in which we find ourselves today. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much indeed, Divine. Thank you for your time, for your excellent presentation. And I thank everybody also on this call for your participation. And let's meet again next week. And so I wish you all the best. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye, and thank you.
Bye, 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 bye.
Bye bye from Ghana.
Bye-bye.
Bye, bye, George.